The year 1941. Nazi Germany, led by Hitler, had taken over Western Europe and the Balkans. In the shadow of ongoing air wars over Europe, Adolf Hitler wanted to open a new front in the Second World War, the Eastern Front. Hitler's dream was to settle the superior German race in the new lands, to be carried in Soviet Russia, exile most of the existing Russian inhabitants to Siberia, and to employ the rest as workers for the Germans. In this way, by combining German technology with rich oil fields, he will destroy England from the air and make them forget their aerial defeat against England in 1940. Another reason Hitler hated Soviets was that he believed the Jews had been brought to power with the Bolshevik Revolution. According to Hitler, the Russians were helpless, inferior people who made the Jews rule. Before the end of the operations in the Balkans, the Germans began massing troops on the Soviet border, and in March, 6,800,000 mixed Axis powers were deployed to the Romanian-Soviet border. After the end of the Balkan campaign, Hitler secretly deployed more than 3 million German soldiers to the Soviet border areas. In addition, Nazi planes were flying over Soviet territory, performing frontline surveillance. Though the Soviet command became concerned by recognizing Nazi activity, Stalin believed that the Nazis were unlikely to attack them, delayed Soviet preparation. Despite Stalin's opinion, Marshal Semyon Timoshenko, together with the Chief of Staff of the Red Army, Boris Shaposhnikov, prepared a defense plan against a possible German invasion. According to this plan, the possible German attack would extend from the Arctic city of Arkhangelsk via Gorky and Rostov to the port city of Arkhangelsk at the tip of the Volga. The predictions of two Soviet generals would be almost 100% correct. If we go back to the German front, the Nazi command started to prepare a large force for the operation they named Barbarossa. A force of 3,800,000 soldiers, including the Northern Army, the Central Army, and the Southern Army, was prepared for war. This land force would be accompanied by 6,867 armored vehicles, including 3,795 tanks, 4,389 aircraft, 23,435 artillery batteries, mortar shells, approximately 600,000 motor vehicles, and 700,000 horses. All of these were deployed ready to operate along a front stretching from the Arctic Ocean south to the Black Sea. If we look at the Soviet front, although they were unprepared for the attack, in addition to approximately 5,774,000 soldiers, consisting of 230 division stations on the border, 39,000 artillery batteries and mortars, 3,000 armored vehicles, 25,700 tanks, and 18,700 aircraft were ready for the battle. It was only a matter of time before the storm broke out between the Nazis and the Soviet Union. At about 11 p.m. on 21st June 1941, an emergency call was sent to the Soviet divisions in the border area. In this order, it was written that all armed forces should be prepared for war, but all kinds of provocative actions should be avoided. A short time later, Alfred Lisko, a Nazi deserter, crossed the Soviet border at around 2 a.m. on 22nd June and informed the Soviet side that the Nazis would launch an attack. Although this information was passed on to Stalin, he considered it disinformation. Insisting that Hitler would not attack him before the first bomb fell, Stalin was only convinced when the Nazis began bombing Soviet-occupied Poland at around 3:15 a.m. on the night of June 22, 1941. After Poland, the Nazi army, which started to bomb the Soviet defenses on all other fronts, officially began to invade the Soviet Union. Parallel to the artillery fire, Nazi planes began to bomb Leningrad, Bessarabia, and Crimea. At about 7 a.m., the Wehrmacht ordered about 3 million soldiers to advance, and the Axis powers, crossing the border, began to destroy the Red Army, which they had caught by surprise. Finnish and Romanian troops accompanying the Nazi forces during the first invasion began their advance at the same time. At 10:30 a.m. on June 23rd, the Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels announced the invasion through Hitler's mouth in a radio broadcast. "We are currently carrying out the biggest offense in the world. Today I have decided to put a fate and the future of Reich and our people in the hands of our soldiers. Within 3 months, we'll witness an unprecedented Russian collapse in history. God help us, especially in this war." The few Soviet soldiers against the advancing German tanks could do nothing but retreat. At 7:15 a.m. on June 23rd, Stalin ordered the Soviet army to retaliate against the Axis powers where they had breached the borders and launch airstrikes on the border areas. Around 9:15 a.m., he changed this order and issued a general attack order against the Germans on all fronts regardless of the borders. Stalin's delay in giving this order was because he believed the attack had been launched without Hitler's permission. Many Soviet settlements fell into the hands of Nazis, as it took several days for Stalin to realize the enormity of the disaster. At around 12 noon, the news of the invasion was announced to the public by the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov as follows: "Without declaring war, German forces attacked our territory, crossing our border in many places. The Red Army and all the Soviet people will wage a victorious patriotic war for our beloved homeland, for honor, for freedom. Our cause is justified. The enemy will be defeated. Victory will be ours." The activity that began on Soviet front was immediately noticed by the Luftwaffe reconnaissance units. As a result of the intense air attacks, the supply depots and airports on the borderline of this Red Army were destroyed one by one. As a result of this attack, the Soviet Army lost 3,922 warplanes and 2 airfields in the first 3 days of the war. Returning to the ground attacks, on 22nd June, Army Group North attacked the Soviet Northwest Front, breaking through the Soviet lines. Having captured Lithuania and Latvia in 3 days, the German forces captured the first target, Pskov, 250 km from Leningrad, on the 7th day of the attack. As for Army Group Center, it was difficult to advance due to the fact that the Soviet forces were the most crowded front, the Pripyat marshes and the Carpathian Mountains. On the night of June 23rd, Soviet tanks launched an attack on German forces from both the north and the south. However, due to the poor coordination, the tanks which were sent piecemeal were quickly destroyed by the German panzers. On 26th of June, the Soviet tanks once again attacked from the same spot, but this time in a more organized fashion, but the result didn't change. After 4 days of hard fighting, the Soviets, who lost 800 tanks, retreated to the Stalingrad line in Kiev. In the Southern Army, however, things went exactly as the Germans wanted. The German army, which started to advance on 22nd of June, together with the Romanian forces, easily pushed the small number of Soviet forces. By July 2nd, important cities such as Lviv, Vinnytsia and Chernivtsi fell into the hands of the Germans. Rainstorms that began in Belarus and Ukraine in early July slowed the advance of German panzers. For this reason, the German 7-day break from the offense was an opportunity for the Soviet defense to regroup. Reinforced along the Stalin's defensive line built in the 1920s, the Soviet army counterattacked the Germans on the 6th of July. However, the German Air Force easily thwarted the counterattack with tank destroyers. On the northern front, the 2nd and 3rd German panzer units were advancing rapidly towards Smolensk, a strategically important city before Moscow. By the 10th of July, the 2nd Panzer Group had penetrated from the south and the 3rd Panzer Group from the north near the city. 3 Soviet divisions between these 2 tank units were destroyed after 6 days of fighting, and the city was captured on the 16th of July. Now there were only 360 kilometers left for the Nazi boots to enter Moscow, the heart of Stalin. However, it soon became clear that capturing Moscow was not easy at all. In the area between Smolensk and Moscow, a wall of flash was built by Soviet soldiers. The Axis powers, which made many attempts to break through this wall, had to retreat with heavy casualties each time. A month had passed since the start of the war, and the Germans realized that they had grossly underestimated Soviet power. Operations were paused, both to allow for resupply and to provide reinforcements. Meanwhile, Hitler held a meeting with his staff. At this meeting, the general commander of the land forces, General Franz Halder, the commander of Army Group Center Fedor von Bock, and almost all the German generals participating in the operation, expressed their views in favor of the continuation of the all-out advance towards Moscow. The generals pointed out that besides the psychological significance of the capture of Moscow, it was an important weapons production center. Panzer Commander Heinz Guderian, an eminent general, also expressed his opinion in favor of continuing the offensive against Moscow. However, Hitler ordered Guderian to direct his tanks north and south, stopping the attack on Moscow. The German armies, which started implementing this order, managed to capture Odessa and Dnieper in the south and Estonia in the north until September 1st. By September, the 4th Panzer Group was ordered to seize Leningrad and enter within 48 kilometers of the city. The Finnish army, on the other hand, moved south from both sides of Lake Ladoga and captured a small piece of Soviet territory. Meanwhile, 400,000 Soviet citizens living in the city of Leningrad tried to build walls to defend the city, while 160,000 voluntarily joined the Red Army. On 7th of September, the German 20th Sumato Division captured Schlüsselburg, cutting off all the highways from Leningrad. Army Group North, which started to advance again on 9th of September, captured areas up to 10 km from the city center by September 19. However, after that, the Germans, whose progress was stopped due to the Soviet attacks, ended the attack as their casualties increased. Enraged by the situation and out of patience, Hitler ordered that Leningrad not be attacked, but instead a blockade of Leningrad in order to ensure that the people surrendered to starvation. In line with this, Leningrad and its people were isolated from both land and sea as of September 22, 1941. This unsuccessful attack on Leningrad so hurt Hitler's pride that he once again turned towards Moscow to take revenge. But before an attack on Moscow could begin, operations in Kiev had to be ended. About 800,000 Soviet soldiers defended Kiev, a strategically important city. The German forces, which entered the city from 3 branches, completely surrounded the city. After 10 days of fierce fighting in which tanks, artillery and planes were heavily used, the city fell on 26th of September. While approximately 200,000 Soviet soldiers lost their lives in the Kiev War, 220,000 soldiers were captured by the Germans. After this war, the Red Army lost its numerical superiority over the Germans. Therefore, Stalin was able to gather only 800,000 soldiers to defend Moscow. On September 30, 1941, the Germans launched the Typhoon operation to capture Moscow. In front of the Germans were 2 defensive lines, one in Vyazma and one in Mozhaisk, to reach Moscow. Russian peasants burned their crops, houses and barns and drove their cattle and horses against German army in order to stop the advancing German troops. The main purpose was to destroy the supplies and foodstuffs needed by the Nazi army. German panzer units attacked Vyazma on the first day of the operation, shattering the Soviet first line of defense. As a result of this shocking attack, 200,000 Soviet soldiers died and more than 500,000 were captured. Now the Red Army had only 90,000 soldiers and 150 tanks left to defend Moscow. When the situation was at its most hopeless, the weather suddenly deteriorated, it started to rain, and the temperatures suddenly dropped. This turned the unpaved roads into mud and slowed the German advance into Moscow. In mid-October, snow fell, then rain again, and the ground was so sticky that the German tanks could not advance. However, unlike the German tanks, the T-34 Soviet tanks could easily move through the mud. This caused German panzers to be easily hunted by the T-34s. Bad weather also caused disruptions in the German supply chain. That's why on October 31, the German army decided to stop Operation Typhoon. During this pause, the Red Army units further consolidated their position, providing 200,000 soldiers, more than 1,000 tanks, and 1,200 aircraft support to defend Moscow. With the ground hardening due to the cold weather, the Germans resumed offense against Moscow on 15th of November. Although the troops were now able to advance again, there was no improvement in the supply situation. Against the Germans was a Soviet army that defended harder than the one they had left. Lacking sufficient fuel and ammunition, the German army advanced within 8 kilometers of Moscow on 2nd of December. Now they were so close to Moscow that they could even see the towers of Kremlin from their positions. But worsening weather conditions once again began to push the Germans. Dense fog also hindered the Luftwaffe's large-scale air operations. Deprived of air support and unaccustomed to winter warfare, the German army slowly began to disintegrate. As a matter of fact, they repulsed 250 kilometers from Moscow until January 1942, during the Soviet counter-offensive that started on 5th of December. On January 7, 1942, Hitler decided to stop the Typhoon operation. The Wehrmacht had lost the Battle of Moscow, didn't get exactly what it wanted, and lost more than 830,000 soldiers. Hitler would soon inform his army of his new targets: Stalingrad. In the month of June in the year 1942, the German forces failed to accomplish their chief objective of acquiring the region extending up to Astrakhan, which was the primary target of the Barbarossa operation. Furthermore, they were unable to seize Moscow and had been unsuccessful in breaching the Soviet defenses, despite laying siege to Leningrad. A furious Hitler, desiring to attack Moscow once again, decided to launch a distinct offensive against Soviet territory. Unfortunately, fate didn't favor the Nazi troops, as they were gradually buried one by one, and Stalingrad would ultimately mark the commencement of the downfall of Hitler. Prior to the commencement of the operation, the German Southern Army Group was bifurcated into two distinct units, Army Group A and Army Group B. The former, under the leadership of General William List, was tasked with marching towards the Caucasus to seize the coveted oil fields in Baku. Meanwhile, Army Group B, commanded by General Fedor von Bock, was entrusted with securing control over the Don and Volga rivers to prevent any potential Soviet offensives from the north. This German offensive was bolstered by an impressive land force of 1.57 million soldiers, complemented by 2,035 warplanes and 1,900 tanks. On the morning of June 28th, Hitler issued orders for both armies to launch a southward assault. The Germans swiftly advanced 300 km in a mere week, and by July 7th had successfully captured Voronezh. Stalin, anticipating that the Germans would target Moscow, had stationed 1.7 million Soviet soldiers needlessly in front of the capital. Consequently, the few Soviet soldiers positioned in the south were quickly overwhelmed by the German invasion. The German army continued to make headway, advancing from the Don River towards the south. On July 26th, managed to capture the strategically important city of Rostov. Meanwhile, the largest army in Army Group B, the 6th Army, led by General Paulus, began its march towards Stalingrad without the support of tanks. However, their progress began to slow down considerably due to the fierce and relentless counterattacks of the Red Army soldiers who were deployed to the front of August the 1st. As a consequence, General Paulus was compelled to request assistance from the Luftwaffe. On August the 1st, the highly effective air unit, German Stuka planes, relentlessly bombarded the Soviet front, resulting in the destruction of 58 tanks, 5,000 Soviet soldiers, and fuel supply depots. Shifting our focus to Army A, we observe that the Germans successfully crossed the Don River and proceed southward towards the Caucasus, effectively capturing Maikop and Elista, where the highly coveted oil fields were located, by August 13th. However, the Soviet resistance intensified significantly at this point, and coupled with numerous supply chain disruptions, the German advance came to a grinding halt. Despite the numerous attempts, the Soviet defenses couldn't be breached, and with the winter on the horizon, Army Group A's commander, General List, realized that the capture of Baku within the stipulated timeline was no longer feasible. Consequently, he resorted to air bombardments to destroy the oil fields in Grozny. Hitler was incensed by this failure and promptly replaced General List with Ewald von Kleist as the new commander of the Army A before September. However, Hitler had imposed stringent restrictions on General Kleist, compelling him to act only with the explicit consent, thereby ensuring that the true command still rested in Hitler's hands. The Soviet army seized this opportunity to regroup, given that both German army groups had fallen behind their targets, thereby enabling them to reinforce the defense of Stalingrad. In early September, the Axis forces departed from Romania, embarking on a perilous journey towards the southern front, with 50,000 soldiers and 6,265 motorized vehicles in tow. Despite the successful capture of most of the Black Sea naval bases upon reinforcement, the Germans encountered a significant roadblock in the form of Novorossiysk, beyond which they were unable to make any substantial progress. In the ensuing days, an additional 50,000 Romanian soldiers were deployed, landing at the Novorossiysk port. However, their arrival was short-lived, as they were vanquished within a mere 10 days, courtesy of a devastating Soviet counter-offensive. Shifting our attention to Army Group B, we observed that the Germans were successful in driving the Soviets out of most of the western bank of the Don River until August 10, 1942. However, the sporadic and persistent Soviet resistance in certain areas caused significant delays in the German advance towards Stalingrad. Consequently, Army Group B commander Fedor von Bock was relieved of his duties by Hitler and replaced by General Maximilian von Weiss. The heavy losses suffered by the Germans in the harsh Soviet defense on the Don made it necessary for Hitler to send additional troops to the Stalingrad front. Eventually, on August 23rd, the 6th Army, under the command of Paulus, successfully crossed the Don River, establishing a defensive line 60 km away from Stalingrad. Hitler lauded General Paulus for his achievement and ordered the 4th Panzer Army to proceed towards Stalingrad to lend support to the 6th Army. However, the narrow and muddy forest road caused a significant traffic jam, with thousands of vehicles from the 4th and 1st Panzer armies causing delays in the German advance by at least a week. Simultaneously, the German air forces launched a relentless assault on the city of Stalingrad, leaving much of it in ruins. The civilian casualties resulting from this barrage were nothing short of catastrophic, with 955 dead and 1,181 wounded in just 3 days. With the aid of the 4th Panzer Army, the Nazi forces began to encircle Stalingrad, slowly tightening their grip on the city. This resulted in all of the Soviet armies and the city's supplies having to be transported via boats on the Volga River from September onwards. In a bid to render this supply chain inoperable, the German air forces embarked on a relentless bombing campaign, causing significant damage to the boats and leading to a dire shortage of both ammunition and food. On September 4th, the southernmost panzer units came perilously close to the city, but the following day, the advance was halted due to the fierce counterattack by Soviet soldiers under the command of General Zhukov. Once again, the German air forces played a pivotal role, bombarding the Soviet artillery positions and defense lines, thereby helping to repel the attack. Within a few hours, the Soviets were forced to retreat, losing a staggering 30 out of 120 tanks in the ensuing airstrikes. One of the high-ranking generals on the Stalingrad front, Andrei Yarmolenko, urgently conveyed to Stalin that a full-scale attack against the German forces was the only viable option to thwart their advance, failing which the city of Stalingrad would inevitably succumb to this Nazi onslaught. With Stalin's concurrence, a massive Soviet counteroffensive led by General Zhukov was launched, but unfortunately it proved to be futile, owing to both the effective operations of the German air forces and an acute shortage of troops. In the battles that ensued on September 6th, a staggering 20 of the Soviet tanks out of 90 in service were decimated by the Luftwaffe. The following day the attack was resumed, but once again the desired outcome remained elusive. In spite of several attempts by the Soviets to breach the German defenses, repeated until September 10th, the city's airport eventually fell into the hands of the Germans. Subsequent to the Soviet counterattacks, the German forces began to advance towards the city of Santa, forcing the Soviet defense to retreat from the outer neighborhoods towards the inner parts of the city on September 12th. General Zhukov, the commander of the 62nd Army, chronicled these tumultuous days in his diary, stating that September 13, 14 and 15 were exceedingly arduous and trying for Stalingrad. We felt powerless to halt the enemy's advance and that the city was on the brink of being overrun. In a bid to stem the tide of retreat, Stalin issued a stern decree warning that any commander who ordered a retreat would be subjected to military tribunals, whereas any soldiers caught impersonating illness or deserting would be executed without mercy. The highest number of arrests and executions during the conflict were reported in the 62nd Army, with 49 soldiers being executed and 139 soldiers receiving various forms of punishment. On September 14th, the Germans launched their first assault on the city, endeavoring to capture the Mamayev Kurgan hill while simultaneously attempting to infiltrate the central train station from a different direction. The ensuing battle was characterized by intense and ferocious fighting, resulting in the train station changing hands an astonishing 14 times in a mere 6 hours. However, the majority of the German troops who participated in the attack were decimated by the Soviet defense, whereas the Soviet side suffered losses amounting to more than 30% of their soldiers within the first 24 hours of the attack. Out of 10,000 soldiers who valiantly defended their trenches, only 320 survived, but they managed to hold on to both Mamayev Hill and the train station, thereby thwarting the German advance. A group of Soviet soldiers led by Sergeant Yakov Pavlov entered a 4-story building in a strategically important location in the city center, which later came to be known as Pavlov's house. The soldiers surrounded the building with mines and set up machine gun positions at the windows. Remarkably, this 20-member unit, which received minimal reinforcements until the end of the Stalingrad battle, never relinquished control of the building to the Germans. Subsequently, the building was designated as a fortress on German maps, and Sergeant Pavlov was awarded the prestigious title of Hero of the Soviet Union.
As of September 27, the German forces had succeeded in occupying the southern section of the city, but had failed to seize the crucial targets along the riverbanks. The Soviet army continued to put up a formidable defense, fiercely guarding the riverbanks, the city's center, and the northern regions of the city. Following September 27, the brunt of the conflict in the city of Stalingrad shifted towards the north and an industrial zone. The Germans, hampered by the unyielding Soviet resistance, made sluggish progress, but eventually succeeded in capturing the three largest industrial facilities in Stalingrad on October 10th. By the end of October, Soviet control over the city had dwindled considerably, and the area they controlled had shrunk to a mere handful of meters along the west bank of the Volga River. It is worth noting that the German Air Force played a pivotal role in this, having carried out a staggering 20,000 sorties by mid-November, dropping an astounding 600 tons of bombs on the city. By early November, the Soviet army had suffered a staggering loss of 60,000 soldiers, primarily due to the devastating air strikes. In comparison, the Germans had lost about 17,000 soldiers, with an additional 3,000 missing and 52,000 injured. Furthermore, the Soviet army had managed to shoot down 650 of the 1,600 planes in the Luftwaffe during this period. As the war raged on with unabated ferocity, Stalin was acutely aware of the dire situation at Stalingrad. In a desperate bid to turn the tide of the conflict, he summoned senior generals Zhukov and Vasilevsky to Moscow and instructed them to devise a plan for the immediate expulsion of the Germans from Stalingrad. At Stalin's behest, a staggering 1.7 million Soviet soldiers from the front near Moscow were dispatched to Stalingrad as reinforcements. But the onset of the winter and the subsequent freezing of the Volga River posed a significant obstacle to their transportation. Zhukov was acutely aware of the urgency of the situation and was compelled to find a viable solution to this daunting challenge. On the German front, although they had seized control of 90% of the city, their progress had ground to a halt as they were ill-equipped to handle winter warfare. Moreover, their unwavering focus on the city had led them to neglect fortifying their positions around downriver, and they had failed to take necessary precautions at the bridgeheads in the north, where Soviet forces had mounted numerous attacks in the past. Similarly, the northwest and southwest fronts of the city were held solely by the Romanian army, which lacked the discipline of the Germans and possessed vastly inferior equipment. Soviet General Zhukov astutely recognized these vulnerabilities in his adversaries and planned the Uranus operation accordingly. According to the plan, the 1 million troops sent as reinforcements will be deployed to the northwest and southwest regions, where Romanian forces were stationed, rather than entering Stalingrad. This would enable the Soviet army to swiftly overpower the weak Romanian army and circle the German Sixth Army, which had surrounded the Soviet army in the city from behind. To execute this operation, a staggering force of 1.1 million soldiers, 800 tanks, 13,500 artillery pieces, and more than 1,000 aircraft were mobilized. However, due to the harsh winter conditions, the Uranus operation had to be postponed twice, first to November 17 and then November 19. At 7:20 a.m. Moscow time and 5:20 a.m. German time on November 19, Soviet artillery commanders unleashed a devastating barrage against the Romanian forces guarding the flanks. This sudden and unexpected bombardment caught the 3rd Romanian Army off guard, causing them to retreat and abandon their positions amidst the thick smoke and fog. The Romanian soldiers, deprived of communication due to damaged lines, were confounded by the incoming Soviet shells and lacked clear directives. Some of those who survived the initial bombardment hastily abandoned their posts and commenced a disordered retreat. In response, Soviet artillery swiftly targeted the second line of Romanian defenses, further decimating the retreating soldiers. At 8:50 a.m., the Soviet army and tanks launched an assault against the 3rd Romanian Army. Initially, the Romanian defense held strong and repelled the attack. However, the absence of the adequate anti-attack guns proved to be their undoing, and their defense rapidly crumbled, triggering a mass retreat around noon. Tragically for the 3rd Romanian Army, they were already encircled by Soviet forces from both the west and the east. In a desperate bid to aid the Romanian forces, General Paulus of the 6th Army dispatched 100 tanks to support them. Regrettably, due to their low fuel supply, only 30 of these tanks managed to reach the combat zone, and half of them were destroyed by Soviet tanks within 2 days. As a severe snowstorm descended on November 19th, the Soviet forces continued their advance southwards, while the coordination between the German and Romanian troops, who were unaccustomed to winter warfare, became increasingly disrupted. On the southern front, in the early hours of November 19th, the Soviet army launched a ferocious assault against the 3rd Romanian Army. Astonishingly, within just 5 hours of attack, the Soviets had managed to capture a staggering force of 27,000 Romanian soldiers. While Soviet planes relentlessly bombed the retreating Romanian forces under arduous conditions, German planes were unable to intervene, save for a few feeble sorties. On November 20th, General Yeryomenko's forces began to encircle the German 6th Army from the south by opening a corridor through the area that the Romanians had abandoned near the Volga River. Meanwhile, the Soviet army in the northwest swiftly advanced towards Stalingrad, penetrating up to 50 kilometers into the city by November 21st. By this time, Romanian forces to the north of the 6th Army had been completely decimated, and the Red Army had begun engaging in the battle with the German 4th Panzer and 6th Army wings. Notably, Soviet tanks in the northwest also made rapid progress towards the south in an attempt to sever the German supply corridor. The German 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army now found themselves ensnared within an ever-tightening Soviet encirclement. On November 22nd, Soviet forces began crossing the Don River and continued to make headway towards the city. However, General Paulus' 6th Army and 4th Panzer Army remained trapped within Stalingrad, having been completely enveloped by Soviet forces on November 22nd. General Paulus and his beleaguered forces, ensconced amidst the chaos and carnage, began to suffer from a dearth of vital resources such as fuel, ammunition, and food. Hitler, in a desperate bid to supply the 6th Army, opted to rely on air transport, but a staggering 680 tons of supplies were required every day for 300,000 soldiers encircled in Stalingrad, a seemingly impossible feat for Luftwaffe to accomplish under the harsh winter conditions. Adding to their woes, the Soviet Air Force had gained the upper hand and posed a grave threat to German planes attempting to fly over the encirclement. Consequently, the sole resource to rescue the trapped German forces was through a ground operation, a seemingly insurmountable task that only one individual was willing to undertake: Erich von Manstein. The German army, beleaguered until December 10th, suffered grievous losses due to the ravages of hunger and the unforgiving winter conditions. Meanwhile, the Red Army redoubled its outer siege, poised to obliterate the trapped German troops. On December 12, 1942, General Manstein launched a rescue operation dubbed Winter Storm. Which entailed the deployment of roughly 120,000 German soldiers, 350 tanks, and 200 planes to liberate their besieged compatriots. Initially, the Germans made considerable headway, with some units covering up to 60 kilometers. However, the tide of this rescue operation began to turn on December 15th, when Stalin ordered 90,000 troops from the Don front to be transferred to the Stalin front to vanquish the encircled German units. Thereafter, Manstein dispatched an intelligence officer to General Paulus, urging him to break the siege and establish contact with their forces. However, Paulus reported that the tanks of the Sixth Army had only 30 kilometers of fuel remaining, and his forces lacked the fortitude to attempt an escape under such harsh winter conditions. On December 18th, General Paulus sent a message to Hitler, expressing his readiness to surrender, which Hitler vehemently rebuffed. Meanwhile, Manstein continued his efforts to breach the Soviet front for 4 days between December 18th and 22nd, but to no avail. With the added burden of fuel and food shortages and the unrelenting winter conditions, Manstein's operation had reached an impasse. After assessing the situation, Manstein began withdrawing his forces on December 24th, marking the unsuccessful end of the winter storm operation. From that point forward, the Red Army, which had mobilized to annihilate the Axis forces in Stalingrad, initiated the Kharkov operation. General Rokossovsky, who had been appointed by the Red Army High Command to lead the operation, issued a call for General Paulus to surrender on January 7, 1943. Rokossovsky promised that all prisoners would be safe, food aid would be provided, and medical support would be extended to the sick if Paulus surrendered within 24 hours. General Paulus sought Hitler's permission to surrender once again, but Hitler swiftly rebuffed the proposal. On January 22nd, when Rokossovsky once again offered Paulus a chance to surrender, Paulus requested time to assess the situation. On January 30th, Paulus contacted Hitler, seeking permission to surrender as he could no longer command men who were bereft of ammunition and food. However, Hitler promoted Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, which is called General Feldmarschall, effectively compelling him to either fight to the bitter end or take his own life, since no German marshal had ever surrendered before. Hitler believed that Paulus would either fight to the death or commit suicide, but he was proven wrong. The following day, Soviet troops entered a ruined building and encountered Paulus and his staff. Paulus surrendered with his staff, but he refused to call upon his soldiers to surrender. Thus, intermittent German-Soviet clashes persisted until the morning of February 2nd, when around 91,000 emaciated, ailing, wounded, and starving German soldiers surrendered. Among the captives were 22 German generals, aside from Paulus himself. Tragically, only 5,000 of 91,000 German soldiers who surrendered survived, with the remainder perishing in POW camps due to the illness, cold, or starvation. Marshal Paulus remained a prisoner in the Soviet Union until 1952, before relocating to Dresden, East Germany.
During the days when the German attempt to capture Stalingrad ended in failure, the Soviet Red Army launched their general offensive in the south with the Operation Little Saturn, pushing back all German forces south of the Don River and retaking Rostov from the Germans. Following this defeat, Hitler delegated authority to plan the war to the German High Command and ordered the swift recovery of lost territory. On February 6, 1943, Hitler met with Manstein and tasked him with defending against the advancing Soviet forces towards the Donbass region. Manstein quickly took action and on February 12 reorganized the German forces and took command of the South Army Group. Meanwhile, on February 8th, Kursk was captured by the Red Army, followed by the Belgorod on February 10th and the important city of Kharkov on February 18th. After shifting to the Western Front and with the arrival of the panzer units, Manstein prepared for an attack against the Soviet army on February 19th. Despite being tired, the German army, with Manstein's superior tactics,
began surrounding and destroying the larger Red Army units south of Kharkov. After completely surrounding the city by March 7th, Manstein launched an attack to capture it on March 11th. Following 4 days of fighting, the Germans completely captured Kharkov on March 15th, and just 3 days later, they took control of the important city of Belgorod. This led to the formation of Kursk salient, which would later become the site of the largest tank battle of World War II. Manstein didn't push further and postponed the Kursk offensive to later dates due to the bad weather conditions and the need to reorganize the exhausted German forces. On April 15th, Hitler ordered the Kursk offensive, which he named Operation Citadel, to be launched on May 3rd. However, Manstein wasn't pleased with waiting, as it allowed the Soviet army to concentrate and strengthen their defenses in the area. On April 27th, Hitler postponed the operation once again and ordered it to be launched on June 12th, summoning all high-ranking generals to Berlin to discuss the plan of the operation. The commander of the German armed forces, General Zeitzler, suggested that a siege attack from the north and south flanks of Kursk could inflict heavy losses on the Soviets and lead to an easy victory. On the other hand, General Manstein believed that a more beneficial strategy would be to launch an attack towards the east from a wider front line, and Panzer Commander Guderian also supported this plan. However, for reasons unknown, Hitler insisted on capturing Kursk first and straightening the German front line. The meeting ended without a decision being made and was postponed to May 3 and 4. Meanwhile, in the Polish city of Warsaw, the Polish people began an uprising against the Nazi regime and attacked German soldiers with a small number of weapons smuggled into the city. After a few days of fighting, the heavily damaged German troops were forced to withdraw from the city. The approximately 1 month-long uprising was suppressed by German forces, supported by reinforcements on May 16, 1943. This short-lived victory gave hope to Polish fighters for a larger resistance in the future. Regarding the Battle of Kursk, the Soviet army, taking advantage of the fact that the Germans were dealing with the Warsaw Uprising, had established a strong defense line on both the northern and southern flanks of Kursk, and even built a main defense line 7 km east of the Kursk. After intense debates, Hitler and his team decided to implement General Zeitzler's plan. However, due to the various delays and technical issues, the operation was postponed multiple times until July 4, 1943. Finally, on July 2, 1943, 3,000 tanks, 2,110 planes, and 900,000 soldiers were ready for Kursk. On July 4, German panzers attacked both the northern and southern Soviet advance posts. Followed by the German planes bombarding the northern Soviet positions and creating a 4-kilometer gap in the Soviet lines. At 2 a.m. on July 5th, Soviet General Zhukov ordered General Vatutin to bomb the German positions with approximately 600 artillery pieces, causing the German advance to stop. As the morning dawned, Soviet planes began bombing the German artillery positions, but the attack was ineffective and resulted in the loss of around 100 Soviet planes. Luftwaffe managed to gain air superiority over the southern front until July 11, but failed to do so on the northern front. In the first 2 days of the battle, the Red Army lost 42 tanks, while the Germans lost 5 Tiger tanks. On July 6, Rokossovsky launched an attack with 300 tanks and air support against the German units in the north. In the ensuing battle between Soviet T-34 tanks and German Tiger tanks, the Germans lost 69 tanks, while the Soviets lost 24 tanks. The northern advance stopped at the 45th kilometer due to the German soldiers finding themselves in a minefield and being hunted by the Soviet artillery. From this point on, the battles on the northern front would be fought with mutual tank attacks. On the southern front, the Germans captured Korocha, 40 kilometers south of Kursk, on the night of July 7. On July 8, German General Vatutin ordered a counterattack with a force of 593 tanks and 200 planes. However, due to the German air superiority, 50 Soviet tanks were destroyed within an hour, and Vatutin ordered the attack to be halted to preserve their current positions. Despite appearing unsuccessful, the attack had managed to push back the German positions. Therefore, Manstein ordered his southern attack towards Brokhovka. During July 10th and 11th, the Panzer Army in the south continued its attack towards its new target, reaching as close as 3 kilometers to Brokhovka by the night of July 11th. The following day, the Germans attempted to launch an assault to take the city, but the Soviet forces under the command of General Rotmistrov repelled them. On the evening of July 12, Hitler summoned General Kluge and Manstein to his headquarters in East Prussia. Just 2 days prior, the Western Allies had invaded Sicily, leading Hitler to order the halt of the Kursk offensive and to relocate the troops there to Italy or southern France. General Kluge welcomed this order, but General Manstein didn't. Believing they could defeat the Soviets in open terrain, Manstein wished to try his luck a bit longer. Thus, Hitler commanded the northern troops to be sent to Italy, and for Manstein's southern front operations to continue for a while longer. Manstein resumed his attacks on July 14th with Hitler's permission, but he underestimated the strength of the Soviet forces and suffered heavy losses. Despite intense air attacks, Manstein was unable to breach the Soviet defense and gradually lost air superiority. In just 3 days, 193 German planes were shot down by Soviet forces. On July 17th, Manstein decided to completely abandon the fortress operation due to his inability to break through the Soviet front. The approximately 13-day-long operation resulted in the complete destruction or disabling of 1,800 German tanks and 2,100 Soviet tanks. Casualties on the German side numbered 54,182, while the Soviet side recorded 177,847. The failed fortress operation was the last major offensive on the Eastern Front by the Germans, and the initiative shifted to the Soviet Union. On July 12, the Red Army launched the Kutuzov operation to capture Orel from the Germans, who had 300,000 troops and 625 tanks defending the city. The Red Army amassed 1,280,000 troops and 2,500 tanks to attack. The assault began in the early morning of July 12, but the Germans put up a fierce defense. Soviet planes hunted German tanks, while German planes chased Soviet planes attacking their tanks. After a month and 6 days of fighting, the Germans were forced to evacuate Orel and retreat to Bryansk, suffering 86,500 casualties, losing 450 tanks and 218 planes. The Soviet Union lost 430,000 soldiers, 2,586 tanks, and 1,014 planes. In the south, the Rumyantsev operation was planned to capture Belgorod and Kharkov. The Red Army mobilized 1,200,000 troops and 2,500 tanks against 200,000 German troops and 227 tanks defending Belgorod. The attack began on August 3rd, although repeatedly interrupted by German air attack. The Red Army steadily advanced. General Manstein and General Ivan Konev employed all their tactics in this tank battle, which lasted until August 23rd, with the victory going to the Soviet Union. The Germans lost their gains from the fortress operation and retreated from Belgrade to Kharkov. Despite suffering heavy losses, Manstein refused to follow Hitler's order to hold on to Kharkov until the end and retreated. On August 23rd, the important city of Kharkov fell to the Soviet Union. The successful operation resulted in 1,000 German casualties, the loss of 240 tanks and 103 planes, while the Soviet Union lost 71,000 soldiers, 1,864 tanks and 153 planes. The Kursk battles witnessed the largest tank battles and the most casualties in a single day of aerial combat during World War II. The fighting lasted for a total of 1.5 months, resulting in approximately 1.3 million casualties on both sides. As the battles raged on in the south, the Red Army planned an operation to capture Bryansk and Smolensk, which had been under German occupation since 1941. The operation began on August 7, 1943, with the Red Army's artillery bombarding German positions at 4:40 in the morning. However, the Red Army was met with the fierce German resistance and struggled to make any headway. General Rokossovsky, the commander at the beginning of the operation, later wrote that they literally threw themselves one by one into the German lines. On the first day of the offensive, despite artillery, tank, and air support, Soviet forces were only able to advance 4 kilometers. On the second day, they made another 6 kilometers to the north, but the German counterattacks throughout August brought the Soviet advance to a complete halt. However, on August 28th, the Soviet Union launched a general offensive towards Smolensk, which resulted in a complete reversal of the situation. In just one day, the Red Army captured a 15-kilometer deep and 100-kilometer wide stretch of land. On August 30, after suffering heavy losses, the German army was forced to evacuate Yelnya and retreat to Smolensk. The Soviet forces were reinforced and prepared for the next offensive between September 7th and 14th. On September 14th, with a large force, the Red Army launched an attack on all fronts and captured Bryansk and Smolensk on September 25th, advancing 250 kilometers to reach the eastern bank of the Dnieper River by October 2nd. Finally, the German soldiers were pushed far away from the capital Moscow, and the Soviet Union could take a breath. The next target for the Red Army was the important city of Kiev. Before the Kiev operation, Adolf Hitler ordered his army to retreat west of the Dnieper River due to the Allies landing in the southern Italy and the Soviet army's capture of all the significant areas along the Dnieper line. This enabled the Soviet Union to easily capture Zaporizhia, Dnipro, Melitopol, and many other important cities by the end of October. The Crimea was also being cleared of German forces. Now Kiev was the next target. On November 3, 1943, General Vatutin's forces launched a massive attack towards Kiev with a large force. The Red Army units that spread from the north of the city to the southwest started to besiege the city. General Manstein, realizing that the siege couldn't be prevented, evacuated his army from the city before the siege was completed. Thus, Kiev was completely captured by the Red Army on November 6, 1943. After the capture of Kiev, no significant progress was made until December. During this time, the city of Zhytomyr changed hands 4 times between the Red Army and the Nazis. Finally, on December 31st, the Dnieper offensive was concluded and the city of Zhytomyr was permanently under the control of the Red Army. Hitler's insistence on holding the Dnieper line despite heavy losses caused a disagreement between him and Manstein. Manstein proposed allowing the Soviet forces to advance further, accepting more losses of territory, and creating a situation where they could be easily surrounded from the flanks rather than defending and suffering daily losses. Hitler favored a war of attrition, but after much discussion, Manstein began openly stating that Hitler needed to relinquish command of Eastern Front to his generals. However, Hitler refused, fearing his power would weaken. On January 12, 1944, the Red Army began an operation to rescue Leningrad, which had been under siege since the beginning of the war. In the early hours of January 12, the Red Army broke through the strong German defenses south of Lake Ladoga, and after 15 days of fighting, the German army realized that they could no longer hold on and began to retreat on January 27th. This ended the 872-day-long siege of Leningrad. On February 28, Soviet Marshal Bagration was seriously injured in an assassination attempt by Nazi sympathizers in Ukraine and died 2 months later. In March, the Soviet Union continued its offensive in the south and captured all the territory up to the Romanian border, including Moldova. Meanwhile, the 60,000-strong German army that was besieged in the city of Kherson in Ukraine suffered a fate similar to that of Stalingrad and was completely destroyed by the Red Army. In May, the Red Army captured Sevastopol, bringing the entire Crimea under its control. After meeting his senior generals, Stalin set new targets for the Soviet Union: the Baltic region and Belarus. Under the leadership of General Rokossovsky, the Red Army prepared to launch an offensive towards the Baltic countries and Belarus, Poland. The German forces defending the offensive area consisted of 460,000 soldiers, 118 tanks, and 600 aircraft, while General Rokossovsky prepared 1.7 million soldiers, 3,000 tanks, and 5,500 aircraft. The offensive began on June 22, 1944, with an unprecedentedly intense artillery bombardment. The date was chosen because June 22, 1941 was the day the Germans opened the Eastern Front. As a result of the intense bombardment, the German defense lines began to break down and the Red Army launched a sudden attack. By June 27th, the Red Army had captured Mogilev and Bobruisk, destroying approximately 70,000 German soldiers. The main target of the offensive, Minsk, was now within reach. On July 1st, the Red Army began to rapidly advance towards Minsk from 3 directions, pushing back the Germans and entering the city on July 3rd. After fierce fighting, the Red Army surrounded the city from the north and west, trapping the 100,000-strong German army group in the city due to Hitler's orders not to retreat. On the evening of July 4th, the Red Army captured Minsk and the German army group was completely destroyed. This defeat was probably Hitler's second largest defeat of World War II. As the situation continued to worsen, a group of opposition generals, including marshals, attempted to assassinate Hitler with a bomb at the headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. On July 20, 1944, although the bomb exploded next to him, Hitler survived the assassination attempt. Returning to the front, the fall of Minsk caused the German army's resistance to collapse entirely. In August, the Red Army came within 10 kilometers of Warsaw and surrounded the German forces in Estonia by controlling a line extending to the Gulf of Riga in the north. Inspired by the Soviet Union's advance towards Warsaw, Polish rebels launched another uprising against the Nazis in Warsaw on August 1, 1944. The Soviet Union decided to end their offensive on this front on August 19th after taking control of Vilnius and Kaunas in the north and Lviv in the south. The casualties from this offensive were approximately 300,000 dead, 250,000 wounded, and 120 prisoners on the German side, while the Red Army suffered approximately 60,000 dead, 110,000 wounded, and around 8,000 prisoners. The Soviet High Command's next target was Romania, which was experiencing internal turmoil. On August 20th, Soviet troops launched an offensive from the west of Romania and encircled the German 6th Army on August 22nd. After being completely destroyed once in Stalingrad, the reformed 6th Army was completely destroyed again on August 23, 1944. On the same day, Romania's King Michael organized a coup against Nazi sympathizer Prime Minister Ion Antonescu and surrendered to the Allies, declaring war on Germany. As a result of this unexpected turn of events, the collapse of the Romanian front caused the German 8th Army in the north to suffer heavy losses and withdraw to Hungary. Following the Soviet victory in Romania, Bulgaria surrendered to the Soviet Union on August 26, 1944. Bulgaria was completely occupied by the Soviet Union on September 8th, and Romania was fully occupied on September 24th. Meanwhile, on September 19th, Finland signed a ceasefire agreement to withdraw from the war. After this victory, the Red Army launched simultaneous offensives towards Hungary, Yugoslavia, and the Baltic countries. By the end of October, the Germans had been completely driven out of Estonia and Lithuania, and the remaining forces in Latvia were surrounded. As for the Balkans, in mid-September, Yugoslav forces began to resist the Nazi occupation, and the Soviet army that came to their aid began to attack Belgrade. Romanian and Bulgarian forces also supported the offensive, while Allied forces landed on the Peloponnese Peninsula and began to advance north. The German forces, struggling to resist attacks from all sides, began to evacuate Belgrade and Macedonia and withdraw northward. Finally, on October 20, 1944, Belgrade was taken by the Soviet-Yugoslav joint forces. Turning to the Hungarian front, the Red Army advanced towards Budapest step by step by November onwards and laid siege to the city at the end of December. The number of German and Hungarian soldiers trapped in Budapest was approximately 80,000. Although they continued to resist for a while longer, the Nazis lost 50,000 soldiers by mid-February and were forced to surrender on February 13. With the occupation of Budapest by the Soviet army on the same day, the German Southern Army Group collapsed, opening the way for the Soviets and their allies towards Vienna, Czechoslovakia, and the southern border of Germany. Meanwhile, on January 17, after intense fighting, Warsaw was finally captured by the Soviet army. From this point on, the Red Army would continue its offensive towards the heart of Germany, attempting to occupy Berlin before the Americans. In January and February, the Red Army launched attacks towards Berlin, taking control of East Prussia, Danzig, and Poznan, before being stopped by German defenses 60 km west of Berlin. Stalin met with his two elite generals, Zhukov and Konev, to explain the importance of capturing Berlin before the Americans. He even promised a bright future to whichever general captured Berlin. On April 13, after the fall of Vienna, Hitler, feeling increasingly concerned, ordered the defense of Berlin until the last soldier fell. After a month of preparation by both the German and Soviet sides, the Red Army began its attacks on Berlin on April 20, 1945, Hitler's birthday. As a result of attacks by both General Zhukov and General Konev, Berlin was encircled. On April 30, Adolf Hitler committed suicide, acknowledging his defeat in the war, and on May 2, 1945, Berlin was completely encircled by the Red Army. General Zhukov was closer to the victory, so General Konev headed towards Prague at the beginning of May. Although a large part of the German army surrendered to the approaching Allied forces from the west, on May 7, nearly 500,000 soldiers were still trapped in Berlin. Violent street fighting continued until May 8, when the circle was gradually tightened. At 2 a.m. on May 8, General Weidling, the highest-ranking commander in Berlin, issued a surrender call on the radio station. General Weidling surrendered to Soviet General Vasily Chukov at 6 a.m. on May 9th and signed the surrender document at 8:23 in the morning. Despite the surrender, some SS units continued to resist, but the war in Europe came to a complete end in the afternoon of May 9, when the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag building. If you enjoyed this video, please support us by hitting the like button. Thanks for watching. See you in the next video.